So we were talking about how the 1920s of reality is actually dramatically different from the 1920s of myth. You know, according to myth, everyone was going to drink bootleg whiskey in speakeasies, everyone was dancing to jazz, everyone was, living a wild lifestyle as like depicted in F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby, when in fact, this is an extraordinarily conservative time. So we mentioned, for instance, that this is a time of real powerful religious fundamentalism. The idea that the Bible is literally true word for word, and that a number of states in this period passed laws making it illegal to teach the theory of evolution in schools. This period will also see the resurrection of a group that first appeared during Reconstruction, and that is the second Ku Klux Klan, which is going to come roaring back into existence in 1915. And so let's cover this and how the Klan came back and how it was a much more powerful force in its resurrection than it was in its original incarnation. Now, it becomes a force in American life in 1915 as a result of both a movie we've talked about before and because of the murder of a young girl, which these two events play together and give impetus to the rise of this group. So on April 27, 1913, Mary Phagan, her name's spelled Phagan, is a 13-year-old girl working at a pencil factory just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. She's found strangled to death on the factory floor. Her boss, Leo Frank, who's the Jewish nephew of the family that owns the factory, ends up getting arrested. He's the last known person to see Mary Phagan alive, and he becomes the chief suspect. Now, this is a very complicated case, and I think it shows the complexity of race relations in this time. The man who points the finger of accusation at Leo Frank is an African American, Jim Conley. He's a sweeper working at the factory. And he claims that he saw Leo Frank washing blood from his shirt shortly after the murder. And he changes the story several times during the course of this interrogation. At one point he says that Leo Frank asked him to help move the body. You know, at other points he says, that he saw the murder itself. The story keeps shifting. Now I want you to think about what this means. In the South in this time, we've talked about lynching. If a black man is near the site of a murder or a rape, he's going to get lynched. There's going to be no presumption of innocence, no due process, whatever. We have a case here where we have an African American who was at the scene of a murder who tells contradictory stories. And he accuses Leo Frank of the murder. Leo Frank gets arrested. So what does this mean? It doesn't change the fact that Atlanta, Georgia in 1915 is a deeply white supremacist society, and that Jim Conley, the black sweeper working at this factory, isn't a victim of racism. But it does mean that, I would argue, the whiteness of Leo Frank, a Jewish man, is held in question. He's seen as a racial outsider as much as Jim Conley was. If Leo Frank had not been Jewish, I think that Mr. Conley would have died that day. So he gets accused of this crime. And the context is important. This is an era that many called the time of the New South. For decades, Southern political leaders, journalists, economic leaders had wondered, what the future of the South would be if it continued to be dependent on cotton growing, on agriculture. The South was substantially poorer than the rest of the country, less well educated, less technologically advanced, social services were backwards, And a lot of leaders in the so-called New South said we have to bring factories in. We have to bring in more industry. And so they offered to northern manufacturers the South is an ideal place. Look, the workers here work for really low wages. We have a divided workforce, split along racial lines. They will turn against each other. If one group goes on strike, the other group will come in to replace them. Plus, by the way, the South uses violence against unions. There are all kinds of advantages for manufacturers if they choose to move south. So these factories move from the north to the south. This pencil factory is an example of that. And they pay terrible wages. Mary Fagan, note, was a 13-year-old girl who worked full-time at that pencil factory. She's being exploited and being paid terrible wages. So white Southerners who are not Jewish look at this factory as an example of two things. Number one, they look at it as an example of the northern colonization of the South and exploitation of the South. These are common, ordinary white folks in the South. Secondly, there's anti-Semitism. Hatred of Jews is pretty deeply woven into the Southern culture of the time, just like anti-black racism is. They believe that there's something sinister about the fact that Jewish businessmen, Jewish families are owning businesses in the South. And so all these toxic ideas are in one terrible poisonous stew, and they're unable to believe this. And this will come out in the trial. And we'll see. They don't believe that Conley, as a black man, is smart enough to make up a story. So, we have the trial take place. That's the argument that Leo Frank's lawyers make. Here's the argument Leo Frank's lawyers make. They say, this is a black man. Black men rape white women. Therefore, Conley has to be the guilty party. The attorneys, the prosecutors who are trying to get Leo Frank convicted of murder say this African-American wouldn't possibly have so much imagination. He's inferior. Meanwhile, the trial is going on. It's during the summer. You have blazing temperatures. They open up the windows. They'll let a breeze in, or what breeze is available. And there's a mob outside of the courthouse chanting this. During the trial, they're chanting where the jury can hear it. Hang the Jew or we'll hang you. So in August 1913, Leo Frank, who is this gentleman here, sitting in the courthouse during his murder trial, there he is right there, is convicted of the murder. There's an implication that rape was involved too, and he's sentenced to be hanged. Now, appeals are going to keep Leo Frank alive for 2 more years. And I'm going to mention someone we've brought up before, Tom Watson. Tom Watson had been one of the leaders of the populist movement. Tom Watson had made speeches in the 1890s where he implored black and white people to come together. He said that they use race to divide you. The rich people are screwing over poor whites and poor blacks together. They're robbing you separately, and they have you at each other's throats so you don't notice the theft. Tom Watson became a very bitter man, and as he aged, he became more bigoted, and he began to blame the failure of populism on African Americans, and he became an obsessive anti-Semite, someone obsessively fearful and hateful towards Jewish people, convinced that they were manipulating the world's finances, and he believes the big banks were behind the misery in the farm bank, and those big banks supposedly were controlled by Jewish people. He's a newspaper editor, and he repeatedly describes Frank as a Jewish aristocrat who raped and murdered a Gentile girl just for the novelty of it. And he told his readers that they better not let Frank get away with it. He better pay a price or there will be other victims in the future. In his words, basically, Jews will then feel like they can get away with anything and rape our women without limit. Well, so this is 2 years. 1915 comes. The Georgia governor is unconvinced of Frank's guilt, and he commutes his sentence to life imprisonment. Now, this causes such an intense, hostile reaction that the governor of Georgia's life is in danger. He actually flees the state before his term is over. And this pardon, by the way, happened towards the end of his term. He was thinking he could get through the term. He's not running for re-election. He could get away with doing what he thinks is the right thing because of that. But his life was actually in danger. He fled to the state of Georgia. So people are aware that Frank's life is in danger while this process is going on. Frank is transferred to another prison. He's there for 1 month. A prisoner slashes his throat. Frank survives. And then a month later, in August 1915, a mob from Mary Fagan's hometown of Marietta, Georgia, breaks into the prison at Milledgeville. They kidnap Frank. They drive him to Marietta, and they lynch him the next morning. Well, members of the lynching party call themselves the Knights of Mary Fagan. And 2 months later, 2 months after the murder, they climb Stone Mountain in Georgia, which is 18 miles from Atlanta. And by the way, Stone Mountain is rather striking for this reason. The man who did Mount Rushmore, those carved bust of the presidents on the side of a mountain in South Dakota, he also did sculpture. He was the first artist on the project to carve the profiles of several Confederate generals on the side of this mountain, including Robert E. Lee. So this has always been a shrine to the Confederacy, a shrine to racism. So the Knights of Mary Fagan gather at Stone Mountain, and they do something that the original Ku Klux Klan never did. They burn a giant cross. And they believe they are expressing their Christian faith. It's the light of Jesus lighting up the world, they say, when they burn crosses. But of course, what it is meant to do is to intimidate and frighten Black people and their perceived allies. Now, we've referred to this movie before, but let me bring it up again. That happens in 1915, which is also the year that D.W. Griffith's film, The Birth of a Nation, comes out, the film that depicts the Ku Klux Klan as the saviors of the South in this period. And it became a hit play, and I want to repeat something that Thomas Dixon, who is the brother of the man who wrote the book The Fundamentals, from which the term fundamentalism comes from. He wrote a novel called The Klansman. He said regarding the purpose of his book, praising the Ku Klux Klan, depicting Black Union soldiers as rapists, he said he wanted to, quote, create a feeling of abhorrence in white people, especially white women, against colored men. And he wanted to prevent the mixing of white and black blood. That was his objective with writing the book, which later became a hit movie. Now, there's an Alabama-born man named William J. Simmons who is aware of the public outrage stirred by the Frank case. He realizes that people are now interested in the Klan because of the movie The Birth of a Nation. The Klan had gone out of business, as we said, essentially, as one big group that crossed state lines. He's a Spanish-American War veteran. He had been a habitual joiner of fraternities throughout his life. So he launches a new Ku Klux Klan, Thanksgiving Eve 1915, with that cross burning. He's at the scene. And this is going to be the start of the second Klan. Now, this Klan is going to be different from the first Klan, not in the fact that it's racist and hateful, but in its scope and the range of targets. In addition to being anti-Black, like the original Klan. And just like the original Klan, they're also going to be anti-strong federal government versus state governments. But they're going to add this. They're going to add fear and suspicion of large cities. They're going to be anti-immigrant. They're going to be anti-Jewish, specifically. They think Jews are here to corrupt American society, that they're not real Americans. They're going to be anti-Catholic. They accuse Catholics of not being loyal to the United States, but being loyal to the Pope. That they see the Pope as their leader, not as the elected political officials here. They're going to be anti-women's voting rights. They're going to be anti-alcohol. They're anti a lot of things. And Simmons is clever in that he sees the Klan not just as a political force, but also as a moneymaker. And so they're going to blend xenophobia, a fear of the modern world, and a traditional anti-Black sentiment. They blend all this together, and this makes this modern Klan really a powerful force across the United States. By 1921, there's an aggressive marketing campaign for the second Ku Klux Klan. A man named Edward Young Clark and Elizabeth Tyler are hired as consultants. And the Klan grows from about 5,000 members to 100,000 members that year alone. And they make the Klan a pyramid scheme. I don't know if you're familiar, where money flows outward. When you sign up someone to join the Klan, you get a percentage of the membership fees, and then that money flows upwards. People at the very top get the most money. So Clark and Tyler, for instance, are given 80% of all profits generated from every person who signs and pays a membership fee in the Klan. So they exploit the American tradition of joining fraternities like the Masons Club or the Lions Club or the Elks Club. And they do all sorts of things, to make the Klan interesting. Secret rituals. You have a secret handshake by which Klan members can identify themselves. They have secret slogans when you greet someone to find out if they're a Klan member or not, because membership is not supposed to be known. You might say something like IKEA, which means a Klansman I am. That's what that stands for. They have a handbook you buy that tells you the guidelines for how a Klansman is supposed to act, and they call it the Quran, just like the Quran in Islam. They love that KL sound. They like repeating it. If you join the group, you can eventually, as you stay in the group, get fancy titles. Like, the Imperial Wizard is the national leader. You get other titles such as Goblin, Ghoul, Titan, etc., based on the level of your membership. And they print directories where everybody who's a Klansman in the community is listed. And if the business is owned by a Klansman, it's listed in that directory, so Klansmen buy from other Klansmen. So it becomes a big money-making scheme. Buying a knighthood in the Klan, by the way, costs you $10. And so there's constantly a flow of money. They organize boycotts against businesses owned by Catholics, owned by Jews, owned by non-Klansmen. And by the way, sometimes people in those groups feel pressured to give. So for instance, there's an orphanage called Hope Cottage in Dallas, Texas, that is opened by the Ku Klux Klan. And they're actually members of the business community, including Jewish people in Dallas, who contribute to this organization to avoid harassment. So by the time we get to the mid-1920s, the Klan has an estimated membership of 3 million. And they're going to play a dominating role in several northern states, virtually controlling the state of Indiana, which is a northern state that stayed in the Union during the Civil War. That becomes one of the epicenters of the movement. They have virtual control of the politics of Alabama, Illinois, Colorado, Oregon, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Kansas. Texas Senator Earl B. Mayfield and Senator Samuel Ralston of Indiana are Klan members. And Klan sympathizers, Friend Richardson, Walter Pierce, won the governorships of California and Oregon. So, it's astonishing. These Klansmen, they can count amongst their membership congressmen, state legislators, sheriffs, police chiefs, district attorneys, cops on the beat. And I want to show you just briefly how open this is and how big this is. This group is, unlike the first Klan, not just a Southern thing, but a national thing. There's a women's auxiliary to the Klan, by the way. The Klan is segregated by gender. Nevertheless, there's a women's chapter. And I want you to note the phrase there, America first, one God, one country, one flag. And what the newspaper for the Klan in Texas is called the Texas 100% American. And the reason they use that word American is they're trying to distinguish themselves from immigrants, who they see as, regardless of their residence in the United States, even if they've had citizenship, that they're not real Americans, because only people from Northern and Western Europe can be real Americans. And that America First slogan is going to be used in the 1930s by people who don't want the United States to go to war against Hitler. And the phrase America First was used by the Trump campaign recently. It's a recurring theme in American politics, setting America against the rest of the world, which supposedly is corrupt. Here's a Klan rally in Washington, D.C. There were so many Klansmen marching in D.C. early 1920s when they held parades that these parades would last hours. And you see how open it is. No one's concealing their faces. No one's going to suffer social stigma, any kind of stigma for belonging to this. So this is it. Now this man here is a Dallas dentist who becomes the leader of first the Dallas Klan and then the National Klan. His name is Hiram Wesley Evans. Evans had a dentist office across the street from Neiman Marcus, which of course was a famous downtown Dallas department store. Nationally famous. People drove from all over the country to go to Neiman Marcus. Evans' dentist office was right across the street. And he becomes the head, what's called the Exalted Cyclops of Dallas Klan number 66. And eventually he leads a coup that overthrows the founder of the Second Klan, William J. Simmons. He becomes the national leader of the Klan. And the Klan becomes such a giant thing that there's actually a very special Klan Day at the State Fair of Texas. You get discounts on your tickets if you go to the Klan. And this is, by the way, the most popular day of the year during the State Fair during this time period in the early 1920s. They still had living Confederate veterans. Confederate Day used to be the biggest day of the Klan. The Klan Day becomes a bigger day. And it's remarkable. The Evans would make speeches there. People sometimes show up at the Klan or at the State Fair in their Klan regalia, their sheets and their robes. So this Klan is going to be a major force. And one of their big priorities is going to be the passage of a bill I've mentioned before, the Johnson-Reed Act, restricting immigration primarily from Eastern and Southern Europe. That law gets passed. And that's the point where you're going to begin to see the Klan decline in membership, because once immigration is cut off, then people feel like one of the Klan's major objectives have been filled. So that's one issue. Secondly, the Klan is run by crooks. The New York World is going to publish a lengthy expose that reveals that Klan leaders steal membership fees for personal use, which is going to cause some people to begin to quit. They feel like they're being ripped off, and of course they are being ripped off. As I said, they already met one of their major objectives, and then the mystique of the Klan is blown up, basically. There's a sense for a while, particularly in the South, places like Dallas, places like Texas, that the Klan can't be beaten. Either stay silent, don't oppose them, or you join, because if the Klan perceives you as an enemy, you're going to be crushed. And that's particularly true of politicians. Well, here's what happens. 1924, we're going to have an election for governor in Texas. And the Democrats are going to nominate the wife of the only Texas governor to ever be impeached and removed, Jim Ferguson. The wife's name is Miriam Ferguson. Jim Ferguson is not allowed by law to be the nominee of the Democratic Party again. They passed a special piece of legislation when he was impeached that was part of the provisions. He could not run again. So his wife's running for him at this point, and she's going to be his voice as governor. She's nominated, or she runs in the Democratic Party primary as an anti-Klan candidate. Now, the Fergusons are racist, let's be clear, and they're anti-Semites, just like the Klan. The issue there is alcohol. Jim Ferguson gets a lot of money from the alcohol industry, and he ridicules the Klan. He calls the Grand Wizard the Grand Gizzard, and he makes speeches mocking the sheets and the robes. So Miriam Ferguson is going to run against the pro-Klan candidate in Texas, Felix D. Robertson, and she wins. All of a sudden, the Klan doesn't seem so invincible. And then what really destroys the credibility of the Klan, because the Klan presented itself as a force defending women and defending Christian morality. They have little crosses on their white sheets, incredibly enough. A little drop of blood from the cross that's supposed to symbolize both the blood of Jesus, but also the purity of white blood. They're the Christian Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, they call themselves. Well, in 1925, the Grand Dragon of Indiana, David Stevenson, is going to be put on trial because he drugs a young woman, he drives her across state lines, he rapes her while she's unconscious, and then when she comes to, she's distraught at what's happened to her, and she commits suicide, and he's convicted for rape and murder. By the way, a reporter for the Dallas Times-Herald, paper that existed up until the 1980s, drove up to Indiana to be a character witness for David Stevenson. So all of a sudden we see this very sharp decline. To use Texas, by the way, I didn't mention this, Dallas, proportionally, membership to total population of Dallas, had the largest Klan chapter in the country. Now, in Texas, membership, after this set of scandals and the passage of the 1924 law, which was one of the major objectives of the Klan, membership in Texas drops from 97,000 at its peak to 18,000 in 1926. Dallas membership drops from 13,000 to 1,200. What that means is the Klan, the second Klan, the Klan is a single national organization, eventually just completely falls apart. And then we see the period of the third Klan, basically from the 1930s on. There is no big national Klan anymore. There are lots of little clans, and the old Klan was run by wealthy people, educated people. The first Klan was. The second Klan was run by wealthy, influential people, even though membership extended to every level of society. The third Klan is mostly people who are on the margins, poor people, people who have little education, people who have little influence. The influential racists are going to join groups that by the 1950s and 60s are called white citizens councils, which have come to be known as the Uptown Klan. And those are the people who are going to lead the effort against desegregation in the 50s and 60s. The Klan will still be there. The Klan will still commit crimes. The Klan will still commit murders. But they're no longer the main force in organized white racism. Now, with such a conservative political culture, it's not surprising that presidential politics and politics at the national and state level follow suit. The United States is going to retreat politically from the ideas of progressivism. I cannot underestimate how unpopular Woodrow Wilson is by the time he leaves the White House. And with him, the idea of progressivism loses steam. And so once again, political leaders are going to return to this concept that which governs least governs best, that the limited government is best form for America, that businessmen should be allowed to make their decisions without government interference or regulation. And I think this is best summarized by Calvin Coolidge, who's going to be the second Republican president in the 1920s. He says at one point, the business of America is business. Congressional leaders and the three Republican presidents in the 1920s, Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, bring back the idea of laissez-faire. We talked about this before. Let me write this down. That's an L. Make that an L. Laissez-faire. The idea that the government should basically step back, let the natural cycles of business take care of themselves without government interference. That idea comes back. The idea of expanding, for instance, consumer safety, regulations of the workplace, all that is rejected. And they believe that the market will take care of everything. Free market will take care of everything. Now, the first president in the post-progressive era is going to be Warren Harding. And I'll show you a picture of him here. Harding is going to be, let me get him up here. Let's see, right here. Here he is. Here's Warren Harding, trying to look smart. Warren Harding is acknowledged by his supporters as a mediocrity, a not very smart, not very threatening person. He's an Ohio senator who really had no record of accomplishing anything in the Senate. No great legislation had his name on it. No great ideas. He's a newspaper publisher, but kind of a non-entity. At the convention in 1920, one supporter of Warren Harding says this about his candidate. He says, there aren't any, or rather he puts it this way, there ain't any first-raters this year. We don't have any Theodore Roosevelts. We've got a lot of second-raters, and Warren Harding is the best of the second-raters. A former newspaper publisher, like I said, he greatly prefers drinking whiskey, which is illegal, but he continues to drink it, smoking cigars and playing poker, and by the way, carrying on an extraordinary number of affairs during his time before the White House and after the White House. And he prefers all that to actually being president. In fact, sometimes while he's president, he'll break down in tears in front of his friends, admitting he has no idea how to perform the duties of his office. He does what Republican leaders in the Congress tell him what to do. So they drastically cut government spending. All those government departments that have been created to run the war effort were shrunk to the size of vanishing. He reduces regulation, and he slashes taxes for the rich. The Harding administration cuts the top tax rate from 73% to 25%. And his Secretary of the Treasury makes a promise. Harding's Secretary of the Treasury. He said, the tax cuts will lead the wealthy to expand jobs, to increase wages for workers, and they coin a phrase for this. They call it trickle-down economics. By the way, a later president will embrace this phrase, Ronald Reagan. It will not work either time. Instead, the wealthy pocket their extra money, their tax windfall, into questionable real estate deals, wild stock speculation, and they would create instability that would later lead to the Great Depression. Harding is a terrible reader of people's character, and he appoints some of the most criminal people ever to serve in the White House, to serve in his administration. The federal government's first Veterans Bureau was created to serve World War I veterans during his administration. But the man he appoints to head that agency, Charles Forbes, spends his time running that Veterans Administration, stealing medical supplies meant for veterans and selling them. He takes bribes from contractors in return for rewarding them bids to construct hospitals. And he fills wildly exaggerated expense reports for expensive trips he takes while he's supposedly inspecting hospital, but he's just taking personal trips. When Harding finds out about this criminal behavior, he demands in person that Forbes resigns, and then apparently he grabbed Forbes by the throat before his aides pull him away because he was so deeply embarrassed. Forbes actually ends up serving 2 years in prison. Harding's Attorney General, Harry Doherty, takes bribes in return for recommending presidential pardons to Harding. For people who are shady, people who are criminal. He sells illegal bonded liquor to bootleg. There's some liquor that can be produced that had to be certified by the government as for export. He pockets money from the sales of German property in the United States, confiscated during World War I. And a Doherty aide, assistant to Doherty, who's involved in these scandals, fatally shoots himself to avoid imprisonment. This leads to the biggest scandal in Harding's administration, what comes to be known as the Teapot Dome scandal. What that relates to is the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, takes $300,000 in bribes from oil companies in return for transferring control of government-owned oil reserves in California and Wyoming from the Navy to his department so he could then lease those oil fields to companies that paid him bribes. For his crimes, Fall becomes the first member of a presidential cabinet to go to prison. So this is going on. The public doesn't know much of this. Harding takes a trip to San Francisco and he mysteriously dies. Now, there's no evidence that there's any foul play, but there have been persistent rumors since that time of Harding committing suicide, even Harding being poisoned by AIDS. That's how sinister these plots got at this time. But when the Teapot Dome scandal breaks, the next president is, many people think, is going to be a breath of fresh air. They're tired of the excitement of Wilson. They're tired of the excitement of Harding and his scandals. Calvin Coolidge is actually welcome for many people precisely because he's completely boring. He's sworn in as the chief executive. The thing he's most famous for is his complete lack of energy. Dorothy Parker is a humorist at that time. When she's told that Coolidge dies on January 5th, 1933, she famously asks, how could they tell? He brags about the fact that he sleeps 12 hours a day. That's the thing most remarkable about Calvin Coolidge. And he's going to continue Harding's policies of small government. We'll talk about Coolidge, and we'll talk about one remarkable member of his cabinet who also served for Harding. The man's name is Herbert Hoover, and how Hoover's policies continue disastrous ideas that dominate the 1920s that directly lead to the Great Depression. Thank you.